Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. We've had some great guests on so far this year, and today's no exception. Thrilled that we're joined by Phill Agnew of Nudge, the UK's #1 marketing podcast, to talk to us about the fascinating topic of nudges and how we can all use them in our businesses to turn more prospects into clients. So Phill, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. Very excited to talk about my favorite topic, nudges.
Excellent. So to keep us all in order, we've got Dan. Dan, do you want to do your housekeeping section, if that's okay, and explain to anybody that's new here how we do things?
Of course. Wow, if I'm keeping everybody in order, I think we're all doomed. Yes, as always, I'm Dan, the head of branding and design here at Yardstick. So what do we all need to know? Looking through the list of attendees on the webinar today, looks like we've got a number of newbies in the crowd. So welcome to your first Yardstick webinar. Now, the familiar faces among you will know that we encourage as many questions and comments as possible, so get stuck in. And of course, we have a special guest with us. So Phill with 1L will lead with his own questions today, but I'll be picking up plenty of your questions to ask Phill with 2Ls. It's the only way I can tell them apart, I think. It's a safe space, so usual rules apply. So ask that daft question, disagree with us. You can, of course, ask sensible questions and agree with us. That's also allowed. But this is your session. Let's get the most out of the hour. And you can do that by using the Q&A box or the chat function. So I'll be monitoring both today and reading them out at regular intervals as we go along. And of course, to assist that effort, our client engagement manager, Abby, will be answering a few of the questions directly in the chat and providing links to any resources we mention as we go. And of course, you're going to want to rewatch this. There's going to be tons of great stuff, so you'll absolutely want to binge it and rewatch it as many times as possible. Abby's going to be making sure that a recording of the session and any show notes will be arriving in your inbox later today. And at the end of the session, she'll be telling us about our upcoming webinars and, of course, a LinkedIn session that she'll be running in early September. So stick around for that. And I think that's it for housekeeping. Now, I'm not sure what the collective noun for multiple Phils is. Is it full rather than Phill? Suggestions in the comments. Anyway, Phill, over to you.
Cheers, Dan. Thank you for that introduction. Right, Phill, welcome. You're a behavioural science expert, and as I've said, you founded and hosted, or host, I should say, the UK's #1 marketing podcast, Nudge. Just tell us a bit about your history and the history of Nudge, if you would.
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, I graduated from university with a marketing degree, which unfortunately cost me close to £50,000, a lot of debt. And I went into my first job as a community manager, which is junior community manager. It's a very low-level marketing role, given things like social media accounts to manage and blogs to write. And I realized so many of the things I was being asked to do, the tactics I was being asked to put out, I had no idea how to do them. I was basically clueless. And this was very upsetting for someone who had spent 4 years at university and £50,000 because I thought I should be a lot better at marketing. But it turns out I'd learned a lot of high-level strategy stuff. I knew a lot about SWOT and the 4Ps and good strategy, bad strategy. I'd read Blue Ocean, but I didn't know how to write copy that was compelling. I didn't know how to write email subject lines that would convert. I didn't know how to create pricing that would nudge people towards spending more. And I really struggled. And it wasn't until maybe 2 or 3 years into my job when I discovered the world of behavioral science. I read Influence by Robert Cialdini, eventually The Choice Factory by Richard Shotton. And I realized that with marketing, when you're in marketing, you can sometimes feel that you don't have a set of laws and principles to guide you. Unlike, say, in finance or accounting, when there are laws and principles you can use to do your work. In marketing, it sometimes feels like you are just throwing a dart at a dartboard blind. You're just trying anything to see if it works. But what behavioral science and psychology and nudge theory can do is actually give you some laws and principles to follow, which will make your work more effective. I realized that. I learned more about behavioral science, started to apply it to my work, and actually did get a fair bit better at my job. And since then, I've been obsessed with the world of behavioral science. I decided I wanted to speak to these wonderful experts and authors and practitioners who apply these things. The best way to do that, secret tip for anyone, is just to create a podcast and invite people on, because people love to talk on a podcast, whereas they don't love to just get coffee over Zoom. So I did that, and I managed to interview some of these people I really adored. And 5 years on, it's the UK's #1 marketing podcast, my full-time job, and what I spend pretty much every waking minute thinking about.
Adored is a lovely word there. Yeah, I love that word. I think it applies to podcasts, and I think Abby would say it applies to webinars as well, given Abby's success at getting certain guests on this year, including your good self. So that was the first time that you've mentioned nudge theory in today's webinar, Phill. And I do want to get really practical later on. Let's start with a bit of theory, if that's okay. Define nudge theory, define nudges for us, if you would.
Perfect. So nudges, first of all, are a maybe smaller tactic within the wider world of behavioral science and psychology. So I'll start with nudges. A nudge is essentially altering someone's behavior without forbidding them from doing something or changing their economic incentives. It is nudging somebody without actually forcing them, without shoving them. So Thaler, who wrote the book called Nudge, and Sunstein, they said to count as a nudge, it must be cheap, it must be easy to avoid, it can't be a mandate. And the very best example of this, which is again from Thaler's book, is a study that Google ran in their canteens. So Google decided that they wanted their staff to eat a little bit healthier. They offer free food in their canteens. And so they decided to tweak where they placed things in the canteen. So rather than having the chocolate at eye level when you walk in, they put the fruit at eye level. Rather than having the still water behind opaque glass and the fizzy drinks behind clear glass, they swapped it round. So suddenly the Coca-Cola was sort of hidden from view. It was still there, but it wasn't purely visible, whereas the still water was. They did a few other things, reducing the size of the plates and a few other tweaks. And they changed what people ate. People ate far more healthier. They consumed better quality calories and fewer fat and all these things. But nobody was forced. They weren't given an economic incentive. They weren't said stop eating chocolate. Their options hadn't changed. They were just nudged in that direction. So that is a nudge. But a nudge also is part of a much wider field of psychology and behavior science, which is essentially the study of human behavior. So behavioral science is the study of how humans behave. And it is a science. This is the important thing here. So everything I'm talking about today, at least, has been tested in a lab, run by a scientist, put in a peer-reviewed journal, hopefully been replicated. There is a bit of a replication crisis in science and psychology, but nevertheless, most of these things have been tested, and that makes it more reliable than, say, the latest Richard Branson book, where he shares all of the wonderful things he did, or Wisdom from a Productivity Guru, where she shares all of the amazing things she does in her day to make it more effective. The point with behavioral science is it's a science, and it's more reliable, and you can try and apply these things to your work, and there should be evidence that suggests it work. It won't always, but it should be more reliable than something like hearsay.
One of your podcasts recently talked about being able to test outcomes. You were talking particularly about subject lines, weren't you? And there was the subject line with American veterans claiming cash benefits that they're entitled to. And then you use some of that knowledge to change some of your email subject lines and saw an increase in open rates, click-to-open rates, etc.
Yeah. So this is quite an interesting one, Phill. So the veterans email is an example of a nudge known as the endowment effect. And this is an effect which was actually first proved, I think, by Daniel Kahneman. And he gave people mugs like this, not with hot cups of tea like I have, but a mug like this. And he said, this mug is yours. I'm giving it to you for free. It's your mug. You can maybe have a cup of tea or coffee from it so it feels a bit like it's yours. And then he asked people at the end, how much would you be willing to give that mug away for if I paid you for it? How much would you be willing to pay it for, to sell it for? And those who had been given the mug and felt ownership over the mug asked for far more money for that mug than those who were just buying a mug that they didn't own, or perhaps selling a mug that they didn't feel ownership over. So when we feel ownership over something, we value it far, far higher. And there's an example of this, a very famous example of this by Nunes and Nunes in 2005, where they tested coffee loyalty cards with customers. So all of us know these loyalty cards. We go to a coffee shop, and hopefully, I think it's a really lovely thing businesses can do. We get a loyalty card, and if we go 10 times, we get 10 stamps. We get a free coffee at the end, essentially 10% off for loyal customers. Really wonderful idea. Except there's a way you can make it far, far more effective. What Nunes and Nunes did is they gave customers 2 types of loyalty cards over the set of 2 weeks. So this is an important thing I'm talking about here. This is called a randomized controlled trial. So some portion of people in the real world, these are real customers, get a card with 10 stamps that are needed to collect. So they need to buy 10 coffees. Another portion of people, this is a different population, so they don't cross over, get a card with 8 stamps that they need to collect, so 2 fewer, except those who got the 10 stamp variant had the first 2 stamps plugged in by the barista. So an economist would look at this and they would say, well, both loyalty cards are identical. Both sets of customers need to buy 8 coffees to get a free coffee. Except the endowment effect showcases that that's not the case. When you get 2 free coffees plugged in for you, you feel that sense of ownership. You feel like, oh, this card is really mine because I've been given that. Like it's something to do with me. There's also other biases at play here, like reciprocity. You want to return the favor. There's gold gradient effect, which is when you've started a task, it's easier to continue doing the task and finish it. If you really don't want to write an email, you just start writing the email. It's actually much easier to then finish the email rather than if you really don't want to write an email and you don't bother starting it at all. And it turns out those who received the coffee card with 2 stamps plugged in, they were, I think it was something like 56% more likely to actually go through and complete the loyalty card and actually get their free coffee. So that's the endowment effect. And then you asked me about an email subject line. So this was a wonderful application of this study. So that study was in a, shared in a peer-reviewed journal. And somebody thought, well, let's apply this study. And this is Maya Shankar's application, where she worked with the Department of Veterans in the US. Now, when a veteran leaves the army, they get entitled to a lot of benefits, which the US government gives for them. But they found that very few people actually enrolled in these benefits. And what Maya did is she didn't try and change the economic outcomes. She didn't try and force people to enroll. She didn't make it default opt-in. She just changed the subject line of the email. The subject line had read, before she got involved, you are eligible for the program. Very standard subject. That's the subject line that all of us would think to write. That's the subject line that AI would write. It's correct. You are a veteran, you're eligible for the program. But Maya knew about the endowment effect, and she knew that people value things more when they feel ownership over them. So she tweaked one of the words to make that feeling of ownership feel present. So she said, you have earned this program. And then beneath that, you had the options to sign up. And just by telling veterans that they had earned the program rather than that they were eligible for the program, increased the amount of veterans who enrolled by 9%. And that nudge was so successful for Maya that it actually landed her a job at the White House for Barack Obama. So this stuff can be really successful. But it's a wonderful example of how just understanding a little bit of psychology and making quite a small tweak can have quite an incredible impact on your career and your business.
Yeah, I can think of, and I think Abby can probably think of one tweak that you made, Abby, about 2.5 years ago along those lines. When Abby applied for Yardstick, she won't mind me saying, she added Yardstick's branding, logos, color palette, etc., to a covering letter, CV, and supporting documents. And in a sea of other applications, that just meant it really stood out and nudged me in that direction. Okay, so with that, there's a couple of examples there of nudges. Give us a couple more of your favorite nudges, Phill, or the ones that you think have been most effective. And then we'll start getting really practical for the financial advisors and financial planners on this call.
I want to just explain Abby's one, because I love that. It's something I've done before, Abby. I've done that when I was applying for jobs. I'd put the logo, and there's two nudges at play there. There's one which is known as the input bias or the effort bias. When you showcase, when you put more effort into your, Rory Sutherland talks about this all the time. When you put more effort into the communication, people value the communication more. If I propose to my partner in a McDonald's, it's unlikely that she'll say yes. If I propose in a 4-star Michelin, 3-star Michelin restaurant, even better if it's a 4-star, I don't even know if they exist, it's far more likely that she'll say yes. If Yardstick want to advertise their business, they should put it on a billboard in an expensive area. That would be more effective, even if they then just take a picture of that and then share it on social and it's only up for one day, than if they do a Facebook ad, because the communication takes more effort. So what you're doing there with the cover letter and the CV is you're putting in more effort. There's a really, really interesting example of this at Starbucks back in 2010. I just learned about this recently, where Starbucks baristas started getting really good at pouring coffee very fast. They could do this thing called parallel pouring, where a single barista could make 4 lattes at once. This sounds fantastic. An economist would say this is brilliant. We're going to save so much money. We can process customers more quickly, and customers like time saved. Except it wasn't. Starbucks realized that customers were enjoying the experience far less because the coffee was taking so little time to make, rather than feeling like a high skilled thing or care laden thing. Instead, receiving a coffee just felt purely transactional and almost like it's being made by a machine. They valued the coffee less because it took less time to create. And this is the same thing with that CV. If you take more time to create a wonderful CV, it will be more effective. But there's another bias at play here, which is really interesting, which is known as the halo effect. And this is a broad bias, which is the idea that it's actually created. It was founded by or discovered by a researcher called Thorndike in the 1930s. He researched soldiers in the army, and he asked generals or their superiors for the opinions on the soldiers. And he found direct correlations between a soldier's basically attractiveness, general appearance, height, and other skills. So if somebody was tall, dark, and handsome, they were far more likely to be rated as a fantastic leader or even have better physical ability than somebody who wasn't. And Thorndike found this and basically said, well, this is a bias. People are basically assuming they have all these other skills because they have a very noticeable good skill. And there's modern day applications of this. There's a really cool study where stores next to Gucci stores, even if they're not luxury stores. So even if you put a Poundland next to Gucci, this hasn't been tested, but all types of stores. But basically, if you put a Poundland next to a Gucci store, the amount of money people will spend at the Poundland will increase because of that halo effect. You're near something of high quality, so you assume it. And I tested this for my podcast. So I asked about 1,000 people on Google surveys, will you listen to Nudge? And for half of them, so another randomized control trial, for half of them, I just showed them my logo. 6.4% said yes. It's probably normal. A lot of people hadn't heard of the show before. They were just basing it off what the logo looked like. 6.4% of people said, yes, I would listen to this if I saw it. But for the other half of the people, I asked them the exact same question. Would you listen to my podcast? I showed them my logo. That was the main part of the image, but just faded behind my podcast logo, just slightly faded and a bit blurred. Well, the podcast logos of very famous shows. So Desert Island Discs, Diary of a CEO, Off Menu, whatever the other popular shows were at the time. So they were just faded in the background. And I was testing out this halo effect again. And it turns out when I said, would you listen to this podcast, and had other popular shows behind mine, 15.9% said they would listen. So it's a massive increase in the amount of people who said they'd listen just because I'm near other popular podcasts. And I think in a way, Abby, you've benefited from the same thing. Phill values the Yardstick logo, sees it as hopefully, as a very good company and one that instills things like confidence and trust and competence as well. And just by being near that logo on your CV, you're probably benefiting from that halo effect as well. So a really good nudge to apply, and yeah, 2 nudges you've included there, which I think are really effective. But you asked about more practical examples, so I'll do a couple more. Social proof. This is one that a lot of people listening in will know about. It's the idea that we follow the actions of others. So we are more likely to do something if we know other people are doing something. If we're on holiday in Greece and we walk past the taverna, which has a massive queue out the door, we're probably going to want to get in that queue. If we hear that Barbie has had record sales at the box office and that everybody is going to see it, will be far more likely to want to go and see that film. And obviously marketers can take advantage of this by simply signaling what of your products are most popular or what people are doing. You can increase your sales. So there's a wonderful, really simple example of this from Richard Shotton. It's a study he did in a pub in London. And he simply went to the pub and he asked the bartender, what is your most popular beer? They said it was London Pride. London Pride actually gets the most sales in this pub. And so Richard said, well, I want to run an experiment. On 1 week, I want you to put a small sign in front of that beer saying, this is our most popular beer. And on the other week, I want you to take it away and I want you to compare the sales for all of your beers during that period. And what happened when the most popular sign was there is sales for London Pride went up by 2.5 times. So this already popular beer gets a dramatic increase in the amount of sales. But what was most interesting is it wasn't like the sales for that one beer went up and the rest went down. It was actually that the sales for that one beer went up and the rest stayed more or less the same. So people were just buying more of that beer. And just by showcasing that other people purchasing a lot of that beer, I've encouraged other customers to do the same thing. So it's a wonderful example of social proof in practice. And I'll share one more if we've got time, Phil, just whilst I'm rattling through these practical examples. That was social proof. There's another bias that a lot of you will know, which is loss aversion. So loss aversion is this idea that we feel that losses are more painful than equivalent gains. So if you walk down the street later today and you find £10 lying on the ground, very unlikely, seeing as no one carries cash anymore, but let's imagine, try and picture what that note looked like. So I know it's a long time since you've seen one, but try and picture one. It's on the ground and you see £10, you pick up £10, you put it in your pocket. You're going to feel good. But what Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky found is that if you lose £10, so not the £10 you just gained, but in another scenario, if you just lose £10, let's say you're mugged and someone takes £10 off you, or you had it in your pocket and it's gone, the pain you feel, the negative feeling you feel of losing that £10 is twice as strong as the positive feeling you would have felt from gaining it. So losses feel worse than equivalent gains. The £10 example is a bit of a different one, but we know this. We don't value maybe our partners as much until they go on holiday or they go away or they break up with us. And we really feel that pain. We don't enjoy the holiday until we get back. And then we can't have that experience anymore. We hate the job while we're in it, but when we leave or we get unemployed, we think, oh, it really wasn't that bad. Losses feel worse than the equivalent gains. And you can use this as a marketer. In fact, Amazon use this brilliantly. I've tried to limit my use of Amazon for different reasons. And back in a few years ago, I did eventually manage to unsubscribe from Amazon Prime, but it's really hard because they laden that whole experiences with very powerful nudges. And the best is when you're going through the process, they say, oh, Phil, just to let you know, you've saved, and it's some astronomical number. It's like, Phil, by the way, you've saved £542.57 over the last 5 years using Amazon Prime. Are you sure you want to lose those savings? It's incredibly effective because suddenly I'm not thinking that I'm, just losing free delivery or something like that. I'm thinking, well, I'm actually going to lose this amount of money over the next 5 years if I keep using Amazon. And Richard Chataway in his book, Behavioural Business, actually researched that with Amazon. They found that just having that message, just saying you will lose all these savings, reduced churn by 42% for Amazon. So 42% of people who would have churned, would have left Amazon Prime, decided to stay because they saw all of the savings they would have lost if they had quit. So another wonderful example. So we've gone through a few there. Halo effect, bit of input bias we talked about with Abby, and then social proof and loss aversion, powerful nudges you can use to improve your business.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And I want to take that theory and get really practical now for the audience that we've got here, which is mostly financial advisors, financial planners and mortgage brokers, and then a few suppliers into those organizations and those people. And I think you've already given us, perhaps unwittingly, a good example of nudge theory and some of these biases in action. I was talking to financial services awards are quite a big thing. Yeah. And I've judged awards, and I was chatting to another judge of awards earlier on this week, and we were just comparing a few scars, war stories, and that sort of stuff. And one of the things we were talking about is the fact that there might be a 1,500 word limit and how we feel as judges if someone's only submitted 800 words, for example. We don't feel they've made a huge effort. And the same, you can often include supporting evidence, PDFs of supporting evidence against your awards. And if the entrant doesn't include that, or they've rushed it, it isn't particularly impressive, again, you don't feel positively disposed to them as judges. So perhaps unwittingly, Phill, there, you talked about a practical example, or you gave me thinking about a practical example that people on this call who are entering awards can actually use to show that they've made an effort with their entry.
Absolutely. And I think, Phill, what you're actually talking about there is a part of behavioral science and nudge theory and psychology that I feel is almost the pillar. Effort does seem to directly correlate with the output that you're after. If you put more effort into something, you get more back. There are nudges that amplify that, social proof. So if you manage to showcase your social proof with more effort, you'll get more benefits from that. You can amplify loss aversion in the same way, but the effort is so crucially important. I actually learned this, as I said, I was talking, at my university course, and maybe this shows how poor quality my university course was. But I learned very quickly. I was getting quite low grades for my coursework, and I thought, oh, this isn't good. And spent a lot of money on this, and I realized this is back before you just sent an email to your lecturer with your essay. You printed it off and you handed it to them in person. I thought, well, I didn't know anything about effort and input bias, but I thought, can I add a bit more effort? So I started to laminate my papers and do a nice binding as well, and really just showcase that I put a bit more time and effort into it. And I'm not kidding, my grades changed overnight. I went from getting 2 2s to 2 1s to firsts just by doing that. And again, that's probably a bad indictment of me and my course. But anyway, enough about that. That showcases that effort is really valuable. And there's so many other examples of this. There's a wonderful study in HBR run by, I think, Michael Norton, or at least Michael Norton's colleagues, which was done in a really interesting restaurant. So this restaurant had a basically view through to the kitchen, very easy way for the diners at the restaurant to see the chefs and for the chefs to see the diners as well. The only thing blocking them was a glass wall. And the researchers wanted to figure out if there's something about seeing a chef create your meal that changes your enjoyment. And so on alternate weeks, they would either keep that glass wall clear or frost over the glass wall. And then they asked people to rate the enjoyment of their meal. And if they found out that people who could see the chef making their meal would enjoy the meal more, would pay more for the meal, and would be more likely to come back. But what's really interesting is it works both ways. When the chefs could see the diners enjoy their meal, they actually also created better food. So there's something incredible about seeing effort and also seeing the output of your effort that clearly motivates people a lot. There's a study with real estate agents, which I've always found quite funny, and it's probably one that your listeners could apply very easily, which was the real estate agents. And this is again a study that's where scientists went and worked with the real estate agents. They basically had a lot of customers who would come to the real estate agents and say, can you give me a list of 10 houses in this area that I would be looking to buy? Maybe this is before Rightmove and stuff. It's a bit of an old study. And so the real estate agents would typically just give 10 houses. And the scientists said, well, let's test this. Hold on. Is there some way you can explain how you're giving them this bit of research that you've done that will change their appreciation of the houses? So they said, for some people, just tell them that it took you 30 minutes to put together this list with the help of your database online, and you were able to do it quite quickly. And for the other people, can you tell them it took you 8 hours to put together? The 8-hour variant was true. So we can maybe talk about ethics in a bit, but the important thing here is the 8-hour variant was true, and that's very important. You shouldn't lie about these things, and I think people are getting very good at noticing when people lie. But the 8-hour variant was true. It had actually taken 8 hours. So you're told it takes 8 hours, and you're looking at the sheet, and you're like, oh yeah, really is everything I asked for. This does have the room for the grand piano that I wanted in my 4th bedroom. Fantastic. And so they then measured, well, what do people think about the houses? How likely are they buy? How many people actually buy? And it turns out when you showcase your effort, these are the same houses, by the way. They're getting the same list that they would have done anyway. But when they said this took me 8 hours to prepare, people were far more likely to rate the houses as better quality, far more likely to go and visit, and far more likely to actually buy. A very simple way for real estate agents to improve their time was just to showcase the effort they were doing. And finally, just to talk about this one last time, you can tell I love this bias. I've tested it myself. I run, like any business, a fair few ads to drive people to my podcast. And I've always liked running ads on Reddit because it's very easy to run tests, very easy to run A/B tests to compare, say, different pieces of copy. And so I think it was 2 years ago, at the end of the year, I created an episode which had the 6 best marketing lessons I've learned over the course of that year. For half of the audience, I just used the copy that I'd used for the episode for this ad. I said, learn the 6 best marketing lessons I've learned over the course of this year in this end of year special nudge, and then an image of the podcast episode. For the variant, I decided to showcase my effort. I said, I've spent 480 minutes speaking to marketing experts this year. Here are the 6 lessons I've learned. So the content is pretty much the same. You're still selling the same benefit. I want people to learn. I want to share the best lessons I've heard this year. But for one of them, I've said, I've spent 480 minutes talking. That's not even that long over the course of the year, I should say. That's really not much time. But that one effort-laden post got a 45% higher click-through rate. So people were far more likely to click on that post. And then I was able to measure they were far more likely to actually go and listen to the episode. So it's a really, really simple way of encouraging people to act. It was just by showcasing my effort. And we've gone for quite simple examples there, literally telling people the amount of time you put into something. But Abby's example is far better because you can actually showcase your effort by putting on the logo of Yardstick on a CV, or maybe binding your essay before you hand it into your lecturer. And that will trigger the same bias. It will cause people to think it's higher quality without actually having to maybe be quite crude and un-British about it and say, oh, I've spent loads of time working on this. So there are some really smart ways you can use this bias to do all these wonderful things. And like you say, Phil, I think applying for awards is a classic version. So if you showcase that you've put more effort into that application, you will be more likely to be picked for that award.
So it sounds as though any of the people on this webinar day, advisors, planners, mortgage brokers, who are maybe having some difficult conversations with clients about price and value, showing their effort either in the way you suggested or the way Abby did, or showing them the amount of time something takes actually might help solve some of those value conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. There's another interesting example of this, which Rory Sutherland shared at Ogilvy's Nudge Stock Talk a few weeks back. It's really interesting. It's a newspaper article from this, I think it's in the Telegraph or Guardian, I can't remember. There was a couple who really wanted to buy a house on this one street. So there's about 20 houses on a street, and they really wanted to buy one of these houses. That's very difficult to do. None of these houses were for sale. So imagine all of us, if we wanted to buy one of these houses, what we do, maybe go speak to a real estate agent. They would say, sorry, none of them for sale. You think, well, okay, it's just, there's nothing I can do. This is impossible. But they decided to use a bit of effort. They wrote a letter to every single one of the houses on the street, posted it through the letterbox. Something like 9 people invited them round. 5 said they were willing to consider, maybe an offer. 2 actually said, okay, here's my price, and 1 person sold them the house. So out of 20 houses, incredible conversion rate there, incredible. But the most interesting thing they did, and this is what Rory Sutherland points out, is they said they didn't type the letter and print it off. They didn't do that because that's easy. That you can do one letter for 20 households, print them all off. It takes maybe 20 minutes. They hand wrote each individual letter. And if you handwrite a letter for someone, especially today, when was the last time we were using handwriting? That showcases that you're putting in a lot of effort. And everybody who receives that handwritten letter is, one, triggered by distinctiveness, because you think, well, I never see handwritten letters anymore, so that stands out in my mind. But 2, immediately acknowledges that there's a lot of effort that has been put into this communication, and is far more likely to read it, far more likely to take action. And so there's something really powerful in the effort you put into how you communicate as well. So I'm not telling you that you should be writing letters to people, but I am saying, let's say you've got a client you want to stay in very good terms with. Just putting more effort into that relationship will really help. Sending them a handwritten Christmas card will really help. Remembering when their birthday is and messaging them about it will really help. This sounds cliche. It sounds sort of like 1990s bits of advice, but there is science and evidence that backs up that it actually works. And so we shouldn't throw it away because we think it sounds like something the madmen would do. We should utilize it because it actually works.
And that takes us to what I want to be called the practical section of this webinar. And one of the things we talk to financial advisors, planners, and mortgage brokers about is ways they can get more referrals and recommendations from existing clients. They're always the best type of new inquiry. They've got the lowest cost of acquisition, the highest conversion rate. One of the things we've preached for a few years now is that when you receive a referral from an existing client, you don't say thank you by picking the phone up. You don't say thank you by email. You handwrite a card. You handwrite the envelope. You lick the stamp, if that's a thing these days, and go and put it in the post box yourself. Because like you say, when it lands the next day or 7 days later, if the Royal Mail's not working as well as it should, and they get a bit of gumph, a bill and a card, they're going to open that card first, aren't they? And it shows the effort that you've gone to. And I remember sitting in a referral workshop that we were doing, and one of the advisors said, "Don't have time to do that. I'm going to get my PA to do it for me." And for me, just the effect of doing it just dropped massively. So delighted that you said that, because it kind of backs up something that we've been saying for years. But in terms of nudges, what other nudges can you think about, Phil, apart from that idea about the card, that advisors, planners, and mortgage brokers can use to encourage their clients to recommend them to more people?
So one is social proof. So there's some wonderful studies into social proof which showcase that it can really shift people's behavior. So an example is, well, the oldest example of this is from Robert Cialdini's book Influence. He worked with hotels in Arizona, and he wanted to encourage guests to reuse their towels, so reuse the hotel towel. The thing that every single hotel room does is they put a card on the bed and they say, "Help us save the environment by stopping reusing your towel." Funny thing to say for a hotel, which is a pretty gas-guzzling corporation that doesn't seem to have any climate conscious things whatsoever, and is printing off these single-use cards every single time. But anyway, they print off those cards. They say, "Help us save the environment." And Robert Cialdini says, "Well, let's try something else. Let's try using social proof." And so he says, change the message that says, "Most guests in this hotel reuse their towel. Please join them." That increased the amount of people who reuse their towel by, I think, 32%. And then he said something even more specific. So social proof gets more impactful when you make it more specific. He said, "Most guests in this hotel room," gives the name of the room, "reuse their towel." And that made people 48% more likely to reuse their towel than the control. So we follow the actions of others, and we follow the actions of those who are similar to us. So those who are staying in our room. So a really smart thing to do if you wanted your customers to refer other customers is truthfully, and this is important, say, well, most customers, if it's true, most customers like you do tend to refer another customer. Or here are some examples of customers similar to you who are also referring others, and they've received XYZ benefits. Most people are doing this thing. That can be a really powerful way to shift behavior. Now, some of you might say, well, only 1% of our customers ever do referrals. It's a really small amount. How do I use social proof? You can still benefit from it if you use dynamic social proof. So this is a study cited in Richard Shotton's book, The Illusion of Choice, where basically it was a separate set of researchers who went to restaurants in the US, and they wanted to encourage more people to eat vegetarian or vegan food. And they couldn't say most customers eat vegetarian or vegan food because it's not true. Most customers don't. Most customers order the steak. And so they had to find a different approach. They still wanted to test social proof. So rather than saying 16% of customers order vegan food, maybe you should try it, that wouldn't be effective, because that's actually saying that not the majority of people don't take this action, so it would backfire. They said the amount of customers who are ordering vegan food and vegetarian food in this restaurant has increased, and this is correct, by 72% over the last few months. Would you like to join them? So they're showcasing that there's a big majority of people who are changing their behavior. well, not a majority of people, but in terms of a change, it seems like a much bigger number. And that's something you could use as well. You could say maybe it's only 2% of your customers who do referrals, but you could say the number of customers who have done referrals over the last 6 months have gone up by 52%. Learn why. CTA, whatever that might be. So that's for quite broad stroke things. There's if it is a real one-to-one relationship, definitely think about reciprocity. So this is, again, is one of Cialdini's principles. If you read his book Influence, he'll talk about social proof, he talks about reciprocity, he talks about liking, talks about a few others. And reciprocity is a bias that all of us know inside out because we've been taught it since we were kids. When you do someone a favor, they return the favor. And this feels so it feels so childish to talk about on a webinar because it's just so obvious. But there's so many studies that prove it works. As the most famous is Dennis Reagan's study in an art gallery. And he set up 2 different variants of the study. One where 2 people walked around an art gallery, looked at the pictures, and then one of them, who was actually his research assistant, but the real participant didn't know this, the research assistant, who was undercover as a fellow art gazer, said, "Oh, by the way, I'm selling charity raffle tickets. Could you buy some?" Not many people buy them. Maybe they buy a couple just because they don't want to feel awkward. And then in another example, the same, different people, but the same quantity. So measuring the 2 side by side. The research assistant earlier in the walk around the art gallery pops out, buys 2 cans of Coke from the vending machine, gives one to their other participant who's looking around the art. Just says, "Oh, I just want to get a Coke. I thought I'd get you one as well." 30 minutes later, he says, this research assistant who's again undercover says, "Can I sell you some charity raffle tickets?" The number of raffle tickets sold increases by 2 times, a 2 times increase in the amount. That's huge. There's so few interventions that are that small that would get that approach. And obviously it's far outweighing the cost of the Coca-Cola as well, which is another important thing. So they're getting a dramatic increase. So people really like to return the favor. If you go to a restaurant and the waiter tells you, "Oh, don't order the lobster today. It's actually not very fresh." The waiter who says that will get a far larger tip and also probably a much bigger order size because people want to return the favor. They think, "Oh, well, they're going out of their way." So that's a really wonderful thing to do. Comment about bribery that you don't have to just do Coca-Cola. That example there is an example of somebody giving a bit of information, which can be a favor as well. Philip Kunz famously sent 600 Christmas cards to random strangers. 200 people replied, even though they were completely random strangers. People like to return the favor. And I think there's just ways you can utilize this. We talked earlier about just sending someone a birthday card or doing someone a favor. These sorts of small things can be really valuable. I haven't released this episode yet, but I've created an episode that will come out not next week, week after next, where I wanted to test reciprocity. So I did random favors for 10 of the biggest influencers in my network. So these are people like Rory Sutherland and Richard Shotton and others, people like that, Jay Klaus. Random favors where I just said, "Can I promote your podcast in my newsletter? Or can I give you a shout out on LinkedIn? I really like your work." They didn't know it, but they were part of a little experiment of mine where I just wanted to see how effective this would be. In a normal working month or normal 6 months, not many very famous, not many big influencers would promote my show. It's unlikely to happen. But I asked 10 people, I gave 10 random favors to 10 influencers, and then asked them after I'd done the favor, "By the way, would you mind returning the favor and promoting my show?" 8 of them did. 8 of them did, which really shocked me. Really, really shocked me. It was incredible. And for this 1 week, I had 8 of the biggest influencers in my space promoting my podcast simply because I did them a favor and simply because I asked. So reciprocity is very powerful. It's a very easy way to change actions. And if you are working one-on-one with a client, that could be a really useful one to use.
Wow, that's fascinating. And just to deal with the bribery point, excuse me, I might be wrong, but I don't know of any FCA rule that says you can't send a client a small gift to say thank you for a referral received. A personalised gift, a book or a bottle of wine or something like that. I've not seen any rules that says you can't do that. Happy to be corrected. Just want to touch on ethics, if that's okay, because you've mentioned it a few times, and there is a line here, isn't there, with nudges, where you can go to the wrong side of it into an unethical place. Just talk about how how ethics play a part in this? You've already talked about it a little bit, but just expand on that a little bit. And then Dan, will come to you for some questions.
There's a really important thing all of us have to consider when we're using nudges, which is, well, first of all, are we lying? Never lie. I think that's just the most obvious thing. I mean, this isn't something that's to do with behavioral science or nudges. It's something to do with common human decency. You know, don't lie. Don't put something on your website which is made up, because more often than not, people will spot it. And then if they spot it, your trust is ruined. And it's just unethical. You shouldn't do that. But the bigger question here is, let's go back to that Google canteen example, because it's such a good example to think about ethics. I'm running Google. I want my staff, or I know my staff, want to eat healthier. I'm going to change where I put things in the canteen, and they will be nudged towards healthier items. Is that ethical? Some people will say, I don't think it is, because people should have the freedom to pick pizza. Well, you're not removing that freedom, but then they might say, well, people were picking pizza before. There's a couple of things at play here. One is that people are always being nudged. So in the Google example, before they make any changes, people are just being nudged towards the chocolate bars at eye level because they are just at eye level. We can't help being nudged in one direction. We can't create a canteen where everything is behind a deal or no deal box and you have to open them all randomly to see what it is. They have to be on show. People will always be nudged towards something. If you give someone a slightly bigger plate, they will just fill it with more. So we've got to understand that the baseline is that people are being nudged anyway. They are being nudged anyway. So a nudge does not necessarily mean that you are putting in a new, doing something new, but they are being nudged anyway. The difference is, of course, is that the nudge previously in the Google canteen may well have just been random and by chance, and there's no individual behind it who's saying, I want people to act this behavior. Whereas once the Google canteen changes, there is an individual who's trying to alter behavior. So then you have to do something which Nir Eyal, who's written the book Hooked and Distractible, 2 very good books, he calls the regret test. And you can actually run this on people. So what Google should do in that scenario is they should gather a portion of the people who go to the canteen. If they're worried about it, they should gather a portion of people who go to the canteen and say, if you walked into this canteen today and you ate a lunch that consisted of really healthy options, still water, fruit, vegetables, maybe a slightly smaller amount of calories than you typically do, would you regret that? And then you should measure the amount of people who say, yes, I would regret that. If 20% of Google employees said, yeah, I would regret that because I really only want to eat pizza every day. That's really why I work at Google. That's what I want to do. Then you should probably think about not doing that. People would regret doing that thing. Then you should think about not doing that. But more often than not, these nudges people would say, well, no, of course I wouldn't regret eating more healthy food. That's exactly what I'm trying to do. And so Google would be okay to put in an implementation like that. In the same way with the UK, organ donation is going from an opt-in to an opt-out. That's because if you ask the majority, and I'm sure the government has done this, if you ask the majority of the UK government, would you regret if when you've passed, your organs are used to help save someone's life? Very few people would say, oh, I actually regret that. And so that makes a tactic like that work a bit better. And you could say the exact same for your customers in the example we're talking about with Yardstick. If you referred a customer to Yardstick or a client referred a customer to one of your other clients, would you regret that? Very few people say, oh, yeah, I'd really regret it if I told a mate about using this financial service agency, unless they really hated the agency, but in which case they're not going to do it anyway. So you just got to think about the regrets. And you can actually ask customers, would you regret this thing? Or you can just play the game in your head as well and think. And another one Nir Eyal says is to imagine that the people being nudged are your family, your mum, your sister, your partner, whoever it might be. Imagine they're being nudged. Would you regret if their behaviors were changed in that way? If it's a yes, then don't do it. And you can instantly see the nudges that are unethical when you put this lens over it. You can see how people who are convinced or persuaded into buying flight tickets immediately because they feel like the price is going to go up in the next 10 minutes would regret that if they then knew that the price didn't actually go up. You can see that that's an unethical use of nudging. But you could also say that somebody who actually decides to go ahead and book their dream holiday because they hear that the price is genuinely going up in the next few weeks wouldn't regret that if they haven't been forced. So just thinking about the regret test is a really good way to overcome the ethics problem.
Thank you, Phil. Well, I don't want anyone to regret not being able to ask you a question, Phil. So we're going to check around a little bit. Abby, you're going to just talk for a couple of minutes about where you can learn more about Phill and future sessions. And then Dan, we're going to come back to you and close with the questions. So if I share my screen, everyone should be able to see that. And Abby, do you want to talk about, if you would, workshop that we've got coming up on a LinkedIn, on LinkedIn?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Phill, there was a bit of effort bias, a bit of halo effect with the job application. There was also quite a bit of gin and tonic bias that afternoon as well, which always helps. So I haven't heard you talk about that one, but I'm sure it's somewhere. But no, just 2 events to tell you about, and a tiny favour from us as well. So we've got our workshop on Tuesday, the 3rd of September. Anybody on our newsletter database will have received that yesterday. It's 10 a.m. till 1 p.m. So it's a pretty mega one, but it's going to be really interactive, really practical. We got loads of good feedback for the one that we ran last year. And we're going to cover off the 4 big things that you need to know about using LinkedIn effectively, from having a great profile, both personal and company, writing really value-adding, engaging posts, connecting with more ideal clients and professional connections, and how best to engage with other people in your feed and why that's so important. So if you do want to use LinkedIn more effectively, if you want to build your brand, if you want to attract prospects, then I really think this session will be of value. So I will put the link in the chat, I'll put it in the follow-up, and it's £95 plus VAT for that one. But our next, that was good timing, Phill, very nice. But a couple of weeks after that, we'll be doing our standard, that makes it sound sub-service. Now, our usual free monthly webinar. We're running solo next month because it's a topic that we really think deserves an hour of both our and your undivided attention, and that's client testimonial videos. We've talked about social proof today. Like Phill said earlier, we follow the actions of those who are similar to us, and it's exactly the same here. One of the easiest, most powerful ways to explain the benefits of working with you to potential clients is to collect client testimonial videos. And we found that 94% of advice planning firms don't have them on their website. So if you do, you will massively stand out from the crowd. So we'd like an hour of your time next month to talk about all things testimonials. Another link in the chat, and it will be in the follow-up. Really looking forward to that one. And then lastly, just a small favour. We don't charge for these webinars, as you know, and we never will, but we do love receiving your feedback so that we can keep improving them in months to come. So an honest Google review, this is not a nudge. I'm not asking you for 5 stars, but we would very much like that. Would be much appreciated, and it should only take you a couple of minutes. So again, in the chat, in the follow-up, thank you kindly.
Thank you, Abby. And then there are Phil's details. If you want to go and look at the podcast, and you can sign up for Phil's newsletter on nudgepodcast.com, and then Phill, I'll put your LinkedIn profile link there as well, and we'll put those in the follow-up email that will come out later on this afternoon. So I'll leave that screen up for a minute. Over to you, Dan, to pose some questions to Phill, if that's all right with you, Phill, to finish off.
All right, let's see what we have. So earlier we were talking about the halo effect, Phill, and you mentioned putting your podcast against competitors, and that raised the level of people that said they'd listen. So Amanda asks a question around that, and she says, your podcast example, would you relate that to keeping close to competitors? I.e., should you be talking about competitors in the same breath as yourself?
I think it depends on the competitors. With my example, they were very clearly bigger shows than mine. They were shows that me as a podcast could aspire to be towards, and one that if the customer or listener associated that podcast with me, then it would be a benefit for me. But if you're the biggest player in the industry, then perhaps you shouldn't do that, because you might end up being compared with somebody who's a lot smaller than you. If you are the biggest player, perhaps you would then want to, instead of comparing yourself to competitors, compare yourself to some of your clients who are really well known, so you can benefit from halo effect that way, putting all those amazing logos of the companies who use you on your website that way. So do be careful about using the halo effect if you're linking yourself to a individual, a company, or an organization that is not viewed in the same high status as you are.
Thank you. Right, next question will go, let's ask Celeste's question. Celeste asks, In the age of automation, do you think people recognize the amount of effort that goes into the comms that they receive?
No, I think definitely not. I think most people don't. And I think that's only going to increase with AI and things like that. And I think that's partly because a lot of the comms we receive it is low effort. I think if you imagine all of the ways that you could receive communications from someone, there are so many different varied and interesting ways you could send comms, and yet most people just send an email without even putting the name of the recipient on the email itself. So I do think there are very easy ways to increase that. Obviously, a lot of it has to be done on smaller scale communications. We get these incredible benefits from going large emails. We can send an email to 1 million people, but that means you can't get very personalized. You can't do things that showcase your effort. And it means that the recipient will very quickly be able to figure out that that email or that piece of communication is sort of low effort, not maybe tailored for them. But what we should never do as marketers is assume, because that's how we send emails to the masses, we should do that on a small scale as well. If you're ever sending an email to a small amount of people who you really want to convince, you should laden it with effort. You should create a video maybe to introduce the email and just say, oh, I'm just putting this together for you. Or you should, there's a test I'm going to run, which I'll see if it actually works. But I think there's a really interesting idea you could do where you could handwrite a message and then take a picture of it and send it via an email. It's another way you could increase the effort as well. But just taking time, I think, to actually craft a bit of comms, which is relevant for them, really makes a difference. I've encouraged Tom Goodwin, who's quite a big marketing influencer, to come on the show. And I sent him an email to pitch the podcast. And he said, that is the best pitch I've ever received for a podcast. This guy goes on a lot of podcasts. So I felt pretty good about that. So I realized, okay, I do think a lot about this. What have I done in my email which made it feel so effortful? I took a picture of myself reading his book and included that in the image. So a picture of me looking really goofy as well, but it was just to showcase, like, I'm actually reading your book. A lot of people don't. I'm going to show that I do. I suggested episode titles which would be relevant to him, that I know there are topics that are relevant. I then had another picture which showcased all of the other guests on my show, people I knew he would recognize: Chris Voss, Bruce Daisley, Dan Pink, Rory Sutherland, and put them below with me talking next to them. So a bit of halo effect there as well. And then this is a nudge I haven't even talked about today, but it's one about reactants. At the bottom, I just said, of course, you're free to refuse. And there's something extremely powerful in telling someone, just so you know, you're free to refuse. Because we always feel we're being sold to. And whenever we feel we're being sold to, reactance kicks in and we don't want to take that action. We don't like it when people tell us what to do. Amazing studies with children where if you put a toy beneath a perplex glass and have 100 other toys around it, all the kids want to play with is the one that they can't touch. We really don't like being told what to do. So I finished the email by saying, of course, you're free to refuse. It's easy either way. He said, oh, it's the best. And he has agreed to come on the show as well. And I do end up getting quite good quality guests on my show. And I think that's just by finding interesting ways to tailor these comms. And you can scale that up if you're smart about it, or you can scale down and find more effective ways to do communications as well.
Thank you. So on the subject of effort as well. So Matt asks a great question. Matt says, more of what we do now, reports, etc., are online or via email, which takes away from the high quality report / key features document that may have been printed and used in the past. How can an advisor showcase quality or perceived effort online? Or are the old techniques of high quality paper and nice reports still the best? And of course, that goes against, some people's direction of sustainability, and a paperless approach is kind of their end goal.
Yeah, the companies I've seen who do reports that I feel I have to read are ones that innately are created by a lot of effort. So there's one that the Product Marketing Association does where I think the report it's called the State of Product Marketing, but they basically start by saying we've interviewed 1,000 product marketers and then their insights are in the report. It's digital, it's online. It's very difficult not to want to click that report, isn't it? When you know that they've interviewed or surveyed 1,000 people, think, oh, there must be something really valuable in there. Or a similar example could be a report that maybe lists the 100 best practices as voted for by you. That could be a really interesting angle. I think there are ways, and this is hard for me to do without knowing the topic of the report you're creating. There are ways you can showcase the effort that has gone into creating a report that you actually alters the content of the report itself. That could just be by design. You could create something that is really beautifully crafted, and that will do that. But it can also be by content as well. I think you should be thinking to yourself, how can we write a report that nobody else could write? And that's probably by doing something extremely effortful. Maybe it's, an example of a marketing report, because I'm a marketer. If I wanted to create a report that I think would do really well on social, I would go around London for 3 days and take a picture of every advert I saw. And then I'd ask 1,000 people to rate them. And I'd say, currently, right now in London, here are the top billboards according to the general public. Like that would just be, it'd be really difficult for a marketer not to want to click that. And that's because it's laden with effort, and you can showcase that while you're talking about it as well. So I think you can find angles. It depends on your context, of course, but there are always angles to add more effort into your work.
That's great. And I mean, one of the contexts that Matt will be speaking about is perhaps an annual report that they give one of their clients. And, speaking from my experience, many default reports will just be a Word document with Times New Roman or Calibri or whatever the new font is that Microsoft are trying to get you to use. And of course, that doesn't have any effort attached to it. But when you do start to put together bespoke documents that link with the website, are consistent with everything else, it's hard not to think that some effort went into it, isn't it? So, and that's something that we can absolutely help with. So, from a personal experience point of view, it's quite an easy win because there's something, you can do quite easily by having just nice templates. So let's see what other questions we've got. I think the next question I'll ask is Adam's question. Now, Adam asked this quite a while ago. Hi, are you aware of any systems that we can use to nudge customers in the UK? And Adam mentions in the US they've got a system called Nudge with a K that seems to be just a follow-up system that gives people prompts for things that they might need from an onboarding process or etc. So what systems exist that we can utilize?
Yeah, good question. I think I've used, depending on what customer resource management platform you're using or email provider you're using, you can definitely build sequences or segments. Intercom is good for this as well, where you can nudge customers consistently or send them follow-up messages. There definitely are some. HubSpot, I imagine, would help with that as well. I would say, though, it's not perhaps my area of expertise in terms of crafting a fantastic email sequence. It's not something I'd say I'm particularly good at. And it will be so industry dependent and company dependent as well. Whatever you use for your CRM should have something in it which allows you to send follow-up messages to people based on the actions they take or don't take. So it is, I wouldn't know what the system is in the UK, but I'm sure there are some.
Add a bit to that, Dan, if that's okay. There's a lot of systems that we will use for those sort of trigger campaigns, sequence campaigns. MailChimp will do it, Digital will do it, HubSpot will do it. And a shameless plug, we spend quite a bit of time writing those as well.
Right, I think we've got one question left. So anybody that wants a last minute question, all you need to do is ask Phill if he'll refuse to answer it. And from what he just said, he'll say no and he'll answer it. But other than that, the last question goes to Joe, who says, we've started making coffee from beans in the office for meetings and put out some biscuits. Very low effort compared to our advice and all the work we put in. But in our most recent survey, it was the coffee and biscuits that made repeated appearances. Trying to understand what clients actually value and care about is a difficult task. We make assumptions that rarely turn out to be true. So short of asking the clients, what's the best way to get this info?
It's such a good example, that, because I think it just encapsulates almost everything we've talked about today, which is that often the action or tactic that is most effective is the one that seems most irrational. If you try to imagine how we're going to get our customer satisfaction score up by 10 points, the last thing you would suggest is, well, let's make coffee with beans and serve biscuits rather than let's increase our service. But often the irrational output is more effective, and the opposite of a good idea can be a good idea as well. Rory Sutherland talks a brilliant example of you can increase the train time by 10 minutes by spending £2 billion. You can increase the HS2 line or the Eurostar, put in high speed rail. It costs £2 billion to decrease the journey time, by 10 minutes. But you could also use that money to serve champagne to every customer on board, to have them served by supermodels, to put in lie flat beds and then offer a lifelong subscription to Sky TV for every single person that went on board. And wow, they would have a much better time than just getting to Paris 10 minutes earlier. There are other things you can do that might seem irrational that would increase value. The question you had is, how do we find these irrational approaches? And shameless plug, but I really do think a lot of them come from the world of behavioral science. What's wonderful about the world of behavioral science is it's sharing often ideas that go counter to our conventional way of thinking, that have also been tested and proven in a peer-reviewed paper, and usually in a lab. The newer ones won't have been replicated, so you should replicate them yourselves and test them, but there is evidence that they work. And what I love so much about them is there are these counterintuitive ideas that you might not think of, but have also been tested. So you're actually basing your next tactic or strategy on some hard, solid evidence rather than something loose and weak. So shameless plug, go and listen to Nudge. You'll get a lot of ideas there, or just read some of the books I've talked about, or listen to some of the authors that I've mentioned. Reading Robert Cialdini's Influence will give you dozens of ideas. Reading Richard Shotton's The Illusion of Choice will do the same. Read Alchemy by Rory Sutherland. These will help you with ideas from that. And you might find that actually hand grinding the beans while the customer is sitting in front of you and pouring their coffee for them, that might even make the experience more enjoyable for them as well.
Brilliant. I promise you this webinar isn't brought to you by Nescafe, but if you do go out and get some coffee beans and some biscuits, apparently you'll have some very happy clients. Brilliant. That's it for the questions today. So unless there's any final ones sneaking in, which it doesn't look like there is, let's wrap up.
Thank you, Dan. Phill, thank you so much for being here today. Thank you for the podcast. Thank you for everything you do for fellow marketers. It's incredibly appreciated. Everybody go and listen to Phil's podcast. Go and sign up to the newsletter. The podcast, one of the things we didn't get to talk about, Phill, is the podcast is actually a really sensible length. What are they, 20 minutes, 25 minutes, 40 minutes? Not this hour and a half, 2 hours you get from some people. So the podcast is absolutely brilliant. Go and listen to it, guys. Go and sign up for Phill. And then massive thank you, Phill, for being here today.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers, guys. See you next month. Bye-bye.
Take care, guys. Bye.